All right. To begin with, why don't you tell us just briefly a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do?
Well, I've been teaching at the University of North Florida since about 2011. Before that, I worked for the Associated Press. I was the deputy international editor, which was in charge of the editing desk in New York, as well as coordination of stories all around the world. And I had about 20 years experience in overseas coverage. I lived in Cairo, Beirut, briefly in Tehran, and then in Jerusalem. And I was in charge of the bureaus in Jerusalem and also in Beirut at the time. And got around the Middle East a lot in the 80s and 90s and covered a couple of wars, and also the Palestinian Intifada, the assassination of a prime minister in Israel, the war in Lebanon, and talked to a few kings and a few terrorists.
That's amazing. Okay, our first question for you, sir. In your opinion, what is journalism?
Well, for me, it was always just an excuse to explore things that I wanted to know about. And I had a particular interest in going abroad from the time I was a teenager, because I just wanted to explore the things I didn't know about. And traveling was sort of a competition among backpackers. Where have you been, and what have you seen, and who have you met? And that just sort of stayed with me long after that faded. But the interest in going places and exploring what's going on, and I think being able to convey that to other people is the journalism part. So it's the communication part. Being able to do it in print, in multimedia, is where the difficulties arise sometimes, and how to make that happen in a way that enhances understanding. But so I would call it exploration and communication in the interest of a better world.
All right. Okay. What do you believe is the greatest misconception about journalism?
That they do what they do for money. As someone who is struggling with a pension these days, I can tell you that money was never an object, at least in my world. I'm not saying some people don't make good money out of journalism, but I always considered journalism to be, a profession and an avocation, and just a way not to become part of a cookie cutter world, and where I could convey what I had learned with a minimum amount of interference. That wasn't always the case, of course, but that was the goal. So my interests were not money, and you often hear that journalists are doing things to sell more stories. That I never had a piecemeal gig type of situation, and the people I knew in journalism didn't either. So I found a lot of dedicated people, and certainly not people who were doing it for money.
All right. Can you tell us a story maybe a pivotal story where your perspective as a journalist shifted a bit, or maybe solidified your idea of what a journalist really was?
Well, I think that any sort of violent story, any kind of war situation, which I encountered in Beirut was something that changed the game in a way, because I was confronted with a kind of reality that I hadn't been accustomed to. This was a zero-sum game. You either survived or you didn't. And so there were situations that were exceedingly dangerous. And situations where understanding that who you were dealing with was really important. And I remember being held at gunpoint by a wounded Palestinian guerrilla in a restaurant after there was a ceasefire in the Lebanon war. And he was waving a gun in my face in circles like this. And it was a 9mm, and I remember the ridges on the opening quite well because I was only a couple of feet away from it. And he did this for quite some time, and he kept asking me in Arabic if I was a little lamb. I thought it would be best to say no. And after about 15 minutes of very tortuous conversation, another guy walked in the same uniform. He wasn't wounded. This first guy had a patch on his shoulder. And he sat down across from him, and he took out his gun, and then they waved their guns in their faces like this. It was some sort of brotherhood thing that, in fact, the waving of the gun in my face was a sort of gesture of acceptance. Little did I know, and the people at the table were almost on the verge of jumping the guy to try to get the gun away from him when this other guy came in. So it was pretty good crossroads for me in terms of understanding, who you're dealing with can be really important.
All right. What's maybe the hardest question you've either had to ask or answer?
Oh, well, I mean, just what pops into my head was there was a guy named Lieutenant Calley who had been accused of carrying out a massacre in Vietnam. And I was tasked by my office with having to call up his family and ask them for their reaction. I found that extremely unpleasant, distasteful, and difficult. But I did it because it did offer someone on his side of the equation an opportunity to respond to what was becoming at that time a viral story about U.S. soldiers' actions in Vietnam. So it was a very uncomfortable thing to have to do. And as a beginning reporter, you had to cover traffic accidents and police blotter type situations, and those were always difficult as well. I mean, there was a lot of difficult stories where families or victims were suffering, and even in later times when I got to the West Bank and Israel sort of coverage, and you would get people who had lost sons, daughters to war or terrorism, and the families were clearly in pain, and you were there to try to provide some understanding of the consequences of these actions. But it can have an impact on you as a person. Even though you're a journalist, you're still a person. And so an accumulation of that can be very difficult for people, just like journalists, just like with police or medical staff or what have you, to see that sort of thing constantly. It's very difficult.
Okay. All right. Can you tell us maybe something that people wouldn't necessarily know about Nick Tatro? Maybe an event, or maybe,
Well, I suppose that I am a fan of pop culture. So I keep up with artists, particularly musical ones that I find very interesting because of the way they think, as well as the way they might sing or otherwise communicate. And I found a number of them are quite interesting people, even though some are very young and some not so young. Recently, I was interested in the hip-hop artist Jidena, whose father was a Nigerian professor, and who had, as he raps, turned down Harvard. He actually went to Stanford, so it wasn't such a big deal, but he wrote a song called Classic Man, which I thought was exceedingly interesting as a merger of sort of music and styling. Also, Ella Yellich O'Connor, also known as Lord. I think she's a fantastic singer and quite an intellectual. She's read books where she tweets out what the books she reads, and they're quite advanced, highly intellectual material, and so that sort of informs a lot of her music because people who write well usually have read a lot. And this is one of the messages I try to convey to students. And when I hear lyrics that are informed in this way, I think it is every bit as good a form of communication as journalism, or even writing poetry, which I did in college, but which is almost a lost art at this point. So where you find it mostly is in music.
Any other artists that you follow that people might not think that you would?
Melanie Martinez,
Okay.
who does this emo stuff with a baby doll sort of get up. I think she's quite talented as a visual artist and as a singer. I don't know about all the baby doll stuff, but that's her thing. And I think there are a number, of really good artists, like Kanye West is an amazingly creative person. Drake, for communication. So I think this is also a bridge to students, keeping up with these things, and I think it helps to understand that in writing, the capturing the right phrase, that 3, 4, 5 words can really have an impact. And that's true in journalism too. We're increasingly dependent on headlines to separate the things people are going to read from the ones they don't. That's no different than trying to distill experience into lyrics, because there's a great deal of compression in it. And I think if I had my druthers, I would probably teach lyrics, headline writing, tweeting, all as one sort of subject.
That's very interesting. Okay, what do you see where do you see the future of journalism in 10, 20 years, say? Where's it headed?
Well, we seem to be going in two diametrically opposed directions. We're going, as I said, to the condensation, the distillation of experience down to tweets and teasers, BuzzFeed, sort of approach to getting people into reading, and of course the social media viral phenomena. And at the same time, we're exploring a new form of collective and cooperative journalism that, if you look at how the Panama Papers were covered, there was sort of the journalists overcame what is traditionally a fear of other journalists, stealing their scoops, and an aversion, an allergy to cooperation. And here the German paper, Süddeutsche Zeitung, forgive my German, initiated this and got papers all over the world to contribute reporters in their countries in a variety of languages to cooperate, and they won an important award, the Polk Award, from Long Island University. So I think that that is a good symbol of that. So is ProPublica, which is an amazing site founded originally by Wall Street Journal reporters. And that does in-depth coverage of all manner of stories that involve the topics, the social issues of the day. So both of those rely on Twitter and Facebook for circulation, but they're going in wildly different directions. And I think we need both of them. We need to be able to have news delivered to us instead of having to search all over the place, because it's time pressure out there for being informed. But if we skip the long reads, then we don't have any real in-depth understanding of issues. If I keep going on that subject, it will be a lecture.
Is it? All right. Well, we won't keep you too much longer. I want to really thank you for agreeing to do this interview with us. On behalf of the crew here in After Image Productions, I'd like to thank you.
Sure, my pleasure, anytime.